Right. Hope you can all hear me. I went to a talk. On Zoom earlier in the year at Edinburgh, where one of their members gave a super talk about. Hang on, whoopsie daisy, about the writer Thomas Hardy in astronomy. And I thought, well, I've read a lot of C.S. Lewis, and I found out there's big connections with C.S. Lewis and astronomy and astronomers. So I hope you find this interesting. Just a quote to start off with. C.S. Lewis said, "Any patch of sunlight in a wood will show you something about the sun, which you could never get from reading books on astronomy. These pure and spontaneous pleasures are patches of godlike in the woods of our experience." C.S. Lewis, I only found out a few years ago, was actually a practical astronomer, amateur astronomer. He had a telescope in his house. He met some quite prominent astronomers in his life, and astronomy comes into his books. The themes of my talk, just to sort of tell you what they are, the main themes are the centrality of Jupiter and the other planets in the writings of C.S. Lewis, a reference to Ptolemy, and something about what Lewis says about the place of imagination in astronomy. Just to note, by the way, that C.S. Lewis was a fellow of Magdalen College, Oxford, at the very same time as Ernst Schrödinger was actually there. And it's more than likely he met him and spoke to him. And at the end of his life, he became a professor at Cambridge, where it's more than likely he met Sir Fred Hoyle. I don't think Sir Fred Hoyle and him would have had kind words, because C.S. Lewis criticised Sir Fred Hoyle, and Sir Fred Hoyle in return criticised C.S. Lewis. Okay, just so we know who we're talking about, C.S. Lewis was born in Belfast in 1898. He served in the First World War. He was a big friend of Tolkien, who wrote The Lord of the Rings. He became a fellow of Magdalen College, Oxford, and at the end of his life, he became a professor at Cambridge. He was an expert in English literature. He converted to Christianity from atheism in his early 30s. He was a prolific writer. He wrote literary criticism, science fiction, children's stories, Christian apologetics, letters, and essays. And he made some broadcasts on the BBC during World War II, and it said the BBC carried out some research, I don't know what they actually did, that he was second only to Churchill in people's ability to recognise his voice on the radio. And he also had a deep knowledge of astronomy. I thought you might like to just see this before I get onto the astronomy bit. On the left is C.S. Lewis as an officer in the First World War, and on the right is J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien, by the way, while he was in the trenches, wrote some provisional notes that eventually were incorporated into his books, The Lord of the Rings. At that time in the First World War, neither of them knew each other, but later on they became colleagues and friends. Just to mention, by the way, that C.S. Lewis, for all his brilliance, the one subject he had problems with was mathematics. And indeed, when he did the entrance exam for Oxford University, he's managed to get some private tuition, but he failed the maths exam twice. But it was lucky that he was in the First World War, because Oxford University changed the rules. Any serving officer could get into Oxford even if they hadn't passed all the entrance exams. So he managed to get to Oxford and spent the rest of his life, most of it, at Oxford. He mentions in his writings that he used to go to the observatory in Oxford, which is the Radcliffe Observatory, shown there, built round about 1773, and that was actually a working observatory up till 1934, when they decided to move the observatory all the way to Pretoria in South Africa. That is now part of Green Templeton College in Oxford. That's a picture of the main room where all the telescopes were. That's a picture of the main room when the telescopes were in there. And that's a picture of it as it is today, to give you some idea of the human scale of it, a man standing there. And on the left is the thing which is on top of the main entrance of the observatory, which is Atlas and Hercules carrying the world. If you ever watch television, an episode of Lewis was actually used this building and it was all about astronomy. Sorry, that's a picture of the quadrant. I've forgotten to put that in. David Sellers, perhaps at the end, may be able to tell me where that is, but that was at one time in the Radcliffe Observatory. The episode was called Dark Matter, and Bill Jones was obviously working as an actor at the time, because this guy on the right looks remarkably like Bill, I think, a Welsh actor called Bernard Lewis, and the program was called Dark Matter. And one of the murders, one of the people in there an astronomer gets bashed over the head with a telescope. So you just have to be very careful what you do with telescopes, otherwise you might find yourself on television starring in Lewis. C.S. Lewis actually died on the 22nd of November 1963, as did the writer Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World. But John F. Kennedy was assassinated on that day, as you might well remember. So the deaths of C.S. Lewis and Aldous Huxley almost passed unnoticed. I'm only putting this in, I don't want to mention the Christian bit again at all, but this was his favourite verse in the Bible, Psalm 19 verse 1, the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. And that was quite central to C.S. Lewis, because he believed that modern astronomy might have lost its way. He actually wrote 3 science fiction books, which you might have read. I've read them. The first one is Out of the Silent Planet. The silent planet refers to the Earth. The second one is called Perelandra, which is a name he gave to Venus. And the third one is called That Hideous Strength. Here are some quite early, garish covers that they used to do for science fiction stories way back in the 1940s and 50s. And the 3 books were actually written during the course of World War II. Right. C.S. Lewis actually invented a language for the purposes of his science fiction stories. So each of the planets was given a new name. So Arbol was called, that's the sun, Sulva is the moon, Trilbia Mercury, Perelandra Venus, Malacandra Mars, Gluncandra Jupiter, and Lurga Saturn. And Fulcandra is the Earth, but also called Tellus, or the silent planet, which I'll not tell you now, but if anybody wants to ask me at the end of it why he called it the silent planet, I'll tell you. I like the name that he gave for the asteroids. He called them dancers before the threshold of the great worlds. And Nereval, that's Uranus, didn't go any further out than that. Okay, a few years ago, a book came out, which I've read, and I believe David Sellers has read it as well, called Planet Narnia, The Seven Heavens in the Imagination of C.S. Lewis. And this guy, Michael Ward, wrote this book. I have actually tried to read it. It's not an easy book. And unless you're interested in relationship with astronomy to other things, I wouldn't recommend it if you just want straight astronomy. What it tries to do is relate things related not to the science fiction stories, but to Ptolemy's view of the heavens, which I mentioned in my last talks. I don't want to spend more than a couple of minutes mentioning it now. And you can see it's a septum orbis, and the 7 planets in Ptolemy's scheme were the moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And each of the books, you know, I've got, oh, there we are, I've forgotten, sorry, I missed that. Those are the 7 books, by the way. You might have read them when you were a child. I read them when I was an adult. They're selling like hotcakes, and since about 2005, most of these, or some of these, have been filmed, so you might have seen the films. So the question is, why 7 books? Well, this guy Michael Ward says the 7 books, each of them relates to one of the planets in the medieval scheme of Ptolemy. Those ones there. And you might say, which is which? Oh, before I forget, by the way, Gustav Holst wrote the Planet Suite, and a few years ago, a few of us from the Leeds Astronomical Society went to hear a performance of it at Leeds Town Hall, where they showed some wonderful photographs of each of the planets, and they played the Planet Suite. But Lewis says about Gustav Holst, he said, of course, there's a great similarity between us because we're both following the medieval astrologers. And what people forget with the planet suite of Holst is not talking so much about the physical characteristics of the planets, but the astrological characteristics of each of the planets. Which planet goes with which book? I'll do this very quickly. The first one refers to Jupiter, the Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. The next one refers to Venus. The Horse and His Boy refers to Mercury. Prince Caspian to Mars. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader to the Sun. The Silver Chair to the Moon. And the Last Battle to Saturn. And very quickly, in the Middle Ages, each of the days of the week was related to one of these planets. So Sunday refers obviously to the sun, life. Monday, the moon, lunacy and mental distress. Mars, Tuesday, war. Mercury, Wednesday, communication and travel. Jupiter, Thursday, joviality, happiness, kingship. Venus, Friday, refers to love. And Saturn refers to darkness and death. And of course, C.S. Lewis spent 30 years teaching at Oxford University, and he will have seen or passed this famous statue of Mercury in the quadrangle at Christ College, Oxford. That, of course, is the planet Mercury. And I thought, since I've mentioned it, and everything I've said has been dead serious so far, I must put Freddie Mercury in. Oh, sorry, Brian Cox wanted to be included as well. Sorry, that's the only reason he's managed to get in there. Right, okay. The favourite planet of C.S. Lewis was the planet Jupiter. And because it's the largest planet, and because in Roman mythology he was the king of the gods, Jupiter, that's why he has a very important place. And the number of times C.S. Lewis mentions Jupiter in his books, a lot. And because I've only got 25 minutes to talk, I can't go through all the references, but he does mention Jupiter a lot. You might have remembered that last year I gave a talk about the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, and mentioning that the great conjunction which took place last year. And Johannes Kepler, of course, he suggested that maybe that conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn was the event that we associate with the Christmas star 2000 years ago. Whether it was or it wasn't, we don't know. But it's a very good fit if it is, because as I said last year, Jupiter refers to kingship, royalty, the king, and Saturn actually does in some books refer to the Jews. So put the two together, King of the Jews, Jesus, it all fits if you want it to fit. I'm very dubious of that, but I thought I'd just mention it. Okay, now we've also said that C.S. Lewis drew heavily upon the Ptolemaic scheme of Claudius Ptolemy back in the 2nd century. But does that mean that C.S. Lewis actually believed it was real, it was true, it was literally true? No, he did not. And it's a misunderstanding if anybody thinks he did. He recognized Copernican cosmology, but he said this: I've made no serious attempt to hide the fact that the old Ptolemaic model delights me as I believe it delighted our ancestors. Few constructions of the imagination seem to me to have combined splendor, sobriety and coherence in the same degree. And just one other quote, Michael Ward says, he, Lewis, recognized Copernican cosmology as a great gain in human knowledge, but he also felt that it had been accompanied by certain kinds of loss, a loss of belief in the symbolic and spiritual qualities associated with the old pre-Copernican cosmos. The universe had become disenchanted. Stars and planets were now regarded as nothing more than balls of rock and flaming gas. Gas, Lewis thought, is what stars are made of. It is not really what they are. Properly understood, the stars are messengers of divine artistry and creativity. Now, you might think that's a load of rubbish, but I want to quote a few other people. Carl Sagan, the late great Carl Sagan, said, a religion old or new that stressed the magnificence of the universe as revealed by modern science might be able to draw forth reserves of reverence and awe hardly tapped by conventional faiths. Sooner or later, such a religion will emerge. I hope Carl Sagan's wrong, because I think there's far too many religions in the world already. But I think it's quite interesting. If you substitute reserves of reverence and awe, and you substitute the word imagination, we can lead on to our next astronomer, Percival Lowell, who actually said, imagination is as vital to any advance in science as learning and precision are essential for starting points. And Percival Lowell, there he is on the left, born 1855, died 1916. It's a great shame because sometimes people say, oh yes, Percival Lowell, he's the guy who mistakenly thought that what an Italian astronomer had called canali were canals, and of course he was wrong. And he then said, oh, that's proof that there was once a civilization on Mars. Well, we know now, or we think we do, that Lowell was wrong, but it was an interesting idea. It's interesting, by the way, that, and I hate to mention it, but since C.S. Lewis thought astronomy and astrology were related, I found out Percival Lowell's birthday was the 13th of March, which is Pisces, which is the same as mine. That probably why his imagination took off and started saying that he thought there were people on Mars. All people who were born in March are all a bit mad. Einstein was born on the 14th of March. But of course, Percival Lowell, let's not forget, was a serious astronomer. And there he is doing his work in the observatory. And don't forget as well, relating to a previous talk I've done, that a lot of the work that he did there at the observatory, you could say, laid the foundations for the later discovery of Pluto. And I'm going to call it the planet Pluto, even though certain people think it's no longer a planet. Okay, so to bring it all to a conclusion, C.S. Lewis said, reason's the natural order of truth. In other words, that's how we find out things. But imagination is the organ of meaning. That's how we make sense of things. And I think that does relate to what Percival Lowell was on about. And I think it does relate to what Carl Sagan was on about. So, some questions to leave you with before I finally get one more thing I want to show you. Does that mean that science and astronomy needs to be more than just an objective collection of facts? How important is imagination in science and astronomy? And don't forget, Einstein, of all people, said, imagination is more important than knowledge. That's slightly taken out of context, but I think the point is valid. So should a cosmological model give you a complete worldview, or should it just give a material description of what you can see? So does Copernican cosmology inevitably involve a loss of reverence and awe, as Carl Sagan almost implied? So can the study of astronomy be a spiritual activity, or is it simply a materialistic thing that we're involved with? And just to bring it all to a conclusion, C.S. Lewis, this quote, somebody said, Michael Ward said about C.S. Lewis, he was not at all like, and this is a quote from C.S. Lewis, the modern educated man who, though interested in astronomy, knows neither who the Pleiades were nor where to look for them in the sky. That's the Pleiades, and that's the picture of the 7 sisters after whom they're named. And I want to quote, last of all, Patrick Moore, because if you look at Patrick Moore's Observer's Book of Astronomy, you'll see that Patrick goes to some trouble to explain the names of constellations and stars, who they are related to in mythology, and he does believe that it's a worthwhile thing to explain who they are. So I'm going to leave you with those questions, and I'm going to leave you with a picture of Jupiter, which was C.S. Lewis's favourite planet, with him shown on the right as the Roman god Jupiter. And well under 25 minutes, I think I've only been speaking for about 20 minutes. So I'm going to say thank you very much, and if you've got any questions, I'll be happy to take them.